On a foggy morning in May 1905, two massive fleets prepared to clash in the narrow waters between Korea and Japan. What followed would become the most devastating naval defeat in Russian history and reshape the balance of world power forever. This is the story of Tsushima, the battle that shattered an empire's dreams and announced the rise of a new naval superpower. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a Russian battleship, exhausted after sailing halfway around the world. Your ship is falling apart, your crew is sick, and you're about to face the most advanced navy in Asia. The fog lifts, and suddenly you see them. Dozens of sleek Japanese warships cutting through the water like sharks, sensing blood. This was the nightmare that became reality for the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima Strait. But to understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we need to go back to where it all began. In the bitter cold of October 1904, in the Baltic ports of Reval and Libau, an extraordinary fleet was preparing for an impossible journey. Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky stood on his flagship, watching as 48 warships and support vessels prepared to steam out of port. Their destination? The other side of the world. This wasn't just any voyage. The Russian Second Pacific Squadron was about to embark on one of the most grueling naval expeditions in history. 18,000 nautical miles lay ahead of them. 7 months of sailing through hostile waters, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, across the scorching Indian Ocean, and up through the South China Sea, all to reach a war zone where the Japanese Navy was waiting. Why would Russia attempt such a monumental undertaking? The answer lay thousands of miles away in the icy waters of Port Arthur, where the Russian Pacific Fleet had been bottled up and systematically destroyed by Japanese forces. The Tsar's Pacific Squadron, once the pride of Russian naval power in the east, was trapped, battered, and dying. If Russia was to have any hope of victory in this war, reinforcements had to come from the Baltic, and they had to come now. But this relief fleet faced challenges that would have broken lesser men. International law forbade them from refueling at neutral ports, which meant they needed to carry enough coal to fuel their journey or arrange for supply ships to meet them in the open ocean. 500,000 tons of coal would be needed. Think about that for a moment. 500,000 tons of coal, transported across 3 oceans, just to keep the engines running. The logistical nightmare was only the beginning. Many of the ships in Rozhestvensky's fleet were ancient by naval standards. While Russia possessed 4 modern Borodino-class battleships, the backbone of the fleet consisted of aging vessels that belonged in museums rather than battle lines. Worse still, the crews manning these ships were largely inexperienced conscripts, country boys who had never seen the ocean, let alone fought a naval battle. You see, Russia's best naval officers and sailors were already dead, captured, or trapped at Port Arthur. The men sailing with Rozhestvensky were what remained. Farmers' sons who had been handed rifles and told they were now sailors. City clerks who found themselves operating massive naval guns they barely understood. These weren't the hardened sea dogs that had once made the Russian Navy feared across Europe. As the Baltic Fleet steamed into the North Sea, disaster struck almost immediately. On the night of October 21st, 1904, paranoia and inexperience combined to create one of the most embarrassing incidents in naval history. The supply ship Kamchatka, trailing at the back of the Russian formation, spotted what its captain believed to be a Japanese torpedo boat. In the thick fog and darkness, he radioed frantically that he was under attack. Admiral Rozhestvensky, already on edge, ordered his ships to illuminate the mysterious vessels with searchlights. What they revealed weren't Japanese warships, but British fishing trawlers from the Hull fishing fleet, nets down, going about their peaceful business in the Dogger Bank fishing grounds. What happened next defied all logic and naval tradition. Russian warships opened fire on the defenseless fishing boats. The trawler Crane was sunk outright, her captain and bosun killed instantly. 4 other vessels were damaged, and 6 fishermen wounded. In the chaos that followed, Russian ships fired on each other, with some crews convinced they were being boarded by Japanese commandos. The battleship Orel alone fired over 500 shells without hitting anything meaningful. The international outcry was immediate and devastating. British newspapers branded the Russian fleet as pirates. The Royal Navy mobilized, and for a terrifying few days, It seemed as though Britain might declare war on Russia. Only immediate apologies and promises of full compensation prevented a conflict that would have ended Russia's naval ambitions then and there. But the diplomatic crisis had consequences that went far beyond embarrassment. Britain pressured France and Portugal to deny the Russian fleet access to their colonial ports for refueling. This forced Rozhestvensky's ships to coal in the open ocean, a dangerous and inefficient process that further weakened his already struggling fleet. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. In the naval yards of Japan, Admiral Tōgō Heihachiro was putting the finishing touches on what would become one of the most formidable fighting forces ever assembled. Unlike his Russian counterpart, Tōgō commanded a fleet of modern warships, crewed by experienced, well-trained sailors who had been preparing for this moment for years. Tōgō himself was a fascinating figure. He had studied at the Royal Naval College in England, learning the latest British naval tactics and technologies. When he returned to Japan, he brought with him not just knowledge, but a vision of what the Japanese Navy could become. Under his command, the combined fleet had been transformed into a precision instrument of war. The Japanese had embraced every technological advancement available to them. Their ships were equipped with the latest wireless telegraphy systems, allowing for coordinated fleet movements that the Russians could only dream of. They had invested in superior rangefinding equipment, giving their gunners deadly accuracy at ranges that left Russian weapons ineffective. Perhaps most importantly, the Japanese had trained relentlessly. While Russian sailors struggled with basic seamanship, Japanese gun crews practiced their craft until they could achieve rates of fire and accuracy that bordered on the miraculous. They had developed new tactics, new ammunition, and new ways of fighting that would soon revolutionize naval warfare forever. As months passed, Rozhestvensky's battered fleet continued its seemingly endless journey. The ships broke down regularly in the tropical heat. Disease spread through the cramped quarters. Men died not from enemy action, but from exhaustion, illness, and despair. The fleet that had left the Baltic with such high hopes was slowly disintegrating even before it reached the war zone. By the time they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, it was clear that this was no longer the relief expedition that Russia had envisioned. It was a collection of floating coffins, manned by sick, demoralized crews, and commanded by officers who knew they were sailing toward their doom. Yet still they sailed on, driven by duty, honor, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they might still save the Russian Empire's fortunes in the East. They had no idea that every mile they traveled was bringing them closer to a rendezvous with destiny at a narrow strait between Korea and Japan, where the most devastating naval battle in history was waiting to unfold. The Japanese weren't just waiting idly for the Russians to arrive. Tōgō had positioned his scouts throughout the waters around Korea, creating an invisible net that would ensure no Russian ship could pass undetected. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He knew the Russians had only one possible destination, Vladivostok, and only one practical route to get there. The Tsushima Strait, that narrow passage between Korea and Japan, was the perfect killing ground. As spring turned towards summer in 1905, the Russian fleet finally approached the final leg of their marathon journey. They had been at sea for over 7 months, and the toll was visible on every ship. Paint was peeling, machinery was failing, and the men looked like ghosts of their former selves. Admiral Rozhestvensky himself was exhausted, his health broken by the stress of command and the impossible task he had been given. The Russians faced a terrible dilemma. They could take the longer route around Japan, adding days to their journey while their coal supplies dwindled to nothing, or they could risk the direct path through Tsushima Strait, knowing full well that Tōgō's fleet was waiting somewhere in those waters. Rozhestvensky chose the direct route. He had no choice. His ships were running on fumes, his men were dying, and every day of delay made their situation more desperate. On the night of May 26, 1905, the Russian fleet crept through the darkness toward the strait. Thick fog blanketed the water, giving them hope that they might slip through undetected. Hospital ships followed behind the main battle line, their lights burning bright in accordance with international law. It was those very lights, meant to protect the wounded, that would seal the fleet's fate. At 2:45 the morning, The Japanese auxiliary cruiser Shinano Maru spotted 3 distant lights cutting through the fog. Her captain approached cautiously, wireless telegraph crackling with reports back to Admiral Tōgō. What they found was the Russian hospital ship Orel, her medical lights blazing like a beacon in the night. The Russians, mistaking the Japanese scout for one of their own vessels, made no attempt to raise the alarm. The trap had been sprung. Tōgō received the wireless message at his headquarters and immediately ordered his fleet to sortie. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of years of training, planning, and technological advancement. His ships slipped their moorings and raced toward the strait, moving with a precision and coordination that spoke to their superior training and equipment. As dawn broke on May 27th, the fog began to lift, revealing a sight that must have filled Russian hearts with dread. Stretched across their path was the entire Japanese combined fleet, 38 warships arranged in perfect battle formation. The rising sun flag snapped in the morning breeze as the most modern navy in Asia prepared to demonstrate its power. The contrast between the two fleets was stark and telling. The Japanese ships gleamed with fresh paint and polished steel, their crews alert and ready at their stations. Wireless aerials stretched between their masts, and the latest range-finding equipment crowned their bridges. These weren't just warships. They were floating examples of everything the industrial age could achieve when properly applied to the art of war. The Russian fleet, by comparison, looked like a museum exhibition that had been left out in the rain. Ships designed in the 1,880 seconds struggled to keep formation with their more modern consorts. Rust streaked their hulls, and the exhaustion of their crews was visible even from a distance. They had sailed halfway around the world to reach this moment, and it showed in every rivet and rope. At 1:55 inches the afternoon, with the range closing to just over 6 miles, Admiral Tōgō made the signal that would echo through naval history. His flagship Mikasa raised the Z flag, the same signal that Nelson had flown at Trafalgar exactly 100 years before. The message was clear to every Japanese sailor who saw it. The fate of their empire rested on the outcome of the next few hours. What Tōgō did next was a masterpiece of naval tactics. Instead of charging straight at the Russian line, he ordered his fleet to execute a maneuver known as crossing the T. His ships turned in succession, bringing their broadsides to bear on the head of the Russian column, while the enemy could only reply with their forward guns. It was a devastating tactical advantage, but it came with enormous risk. For several crucial minutes, as his ships made the turn, they would be vulnerable to concentrated Russian fire. The Russians, recognizing the danger, opened fire immediately. Shells screamed across the water as both fleets unleashed their fury. But here, the months of preparation and training showed their worth. Japanese gunnery was precise and devastating, their shells finding their targets with uncanny accuracy. Russian fire, hampered by obsolete equipment and exhausted crews, splashed harmlessly into the sea or sailed wide of their marks. Within minutes of the battle's opening, the Russian flagship Kniaz Suvorov was hit by a storm of Japanese shells. Admiral Rozhestvensky was wounded and knocked unconscious, his command shattered along with his ship's bridge. Without their commander, the Russian fleet began to fall apart. Ships broke formation, signals went unanswered, and what should have been coordinated tactics dissolved into individual acts of desperate courage. The Japanese had brought something new to the battle that the Russians had never encountered. Their shells were loaded with a new type of explosive that created devastating fires on impact. Where Russian armor-piercing rounds might penetrate a ship's hull and cause localized damage, Japanese high-explosive shells turned entire superstructures into infernos. The psychological effect on the Russian crews was as devastating as the physical damage to their ships. As the afternoon wore on, the slaughter intensified. One by one, the pride of the Russian Baltic Fleet was reduced to burning wrecks. The battleship Ozliabya, flagship of the 2nd Battleship Division, was the first to succumb, her magazines exploding in a pillar of fire that could be seen for miles. The Imperator Alexander III followed, then the Borodino, each death representing not just the loss of a ship, but the destruction of Russia's dreams of naval supremacy in the Pacific. By nightfall on May 27th, the main phase of the battle was over. But the nightmare for the Russians was just beginning. 4 of their finest battleships lay at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait, taking with them thousands of sailors and the last hopes of the Baltic Fleet. Admiral Rozhestvensky, badly wounded and barely conscious, had been transferred to a destroyer that slipped away into the darkness. Command of what remained of the fleet fell to Admiral Nebogatov, a man who now faced an impossible choice. The survivors of the day battle huddled together in the darkness, their ships battered, their crews in shock. Fires still burned on several vessels, casting an eerie glow across the water. The smell of cordite and smoke hung heavy in the air, mixed with something far worse, the stench of death that no sailor ever forgets once they've encountered it. These men had witnessed the end of an era, the final destruction of Russian naval power in the Pacific. But Tōgō wasn't finished. As darkness fell, he unleashed the second phase of his carefully orchestrated plan. Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats, like wolves sensing wounded prey, raced through the night toward the scattered remnants of the Russian fleet. These small, fast vessels carried weapons that could sink the mightiest battleship with a single, well-placed hit. The torpedo, that underwater missile that had revolutionized naval warfare, was about to deliver the final blow to Russian ambitions. The night attacks were a horror beyond description. Russian sailors, already exhausted and demoralized, found themselves under assault from enemies they could barely see. Torpedoes streaked through the dark water like deadly fish, their wakes phosphorescent trails of doom. The destroyer Bezupreshny was struck and sank immediately. The coastal defense ship Admiral Ushakov fought a desperate last stand before being overwhelmed. One by one, the surviving Russian vessels were hunted down and destroyed. The technology that had given Japan such an advantage during the day battle continued to serve them in the darkness. Wireless telegraphy allowed Tōgō to coordinate his scattered forces with precision that the Russians couldn't match. Japanese commanders could communicate instantly across miles of ocean, directing their torpedo boats toward targets and away from friendly forces. The Russians, lacking this capability, fought in isolation, each ship a lonely island in a sea of enemies. As dawn broke on May 28th, the true scale of the catastrophe became clear. Of the 38 warships that had entered the strait with such hope just 2 days before, only a handful remained afloat. Admiral Nebogatov, surveying the wreckage of his fleet, faced a decision that no naval officer should ever have to make. He could continue fighting and watch the rest of his men die in a hopeless cause, or he could surrender and save the lives that remained. The surrender, when it came, was as dramatic as the battle itself. At 10:34 inches the morning, Russian signal flags spelled out the message that no admiral wants to send. We surrender. The surviving Russian ships, battered and burning, raised white flags and waited for Japanese boarding parties to take possession. It was a moment that marked not just the end of a battle, but the end of Russian dreams of empire in the East. The final tally was staggering in its completeness. Of the Russian fleet that had sailed so confidently into the strait, 21 ships had been sunk outright. 7 more were captured, their crews now prisoners of war. 6 vessels were interned in neutral ports, effectively removed from the war. Only 3 small ships, a cruiser and 2 destroyers, managed to reach the safety of Vladivostok, the original destination of the entire expedition. The human cost was equally devastating. Over 5,000 Russian sailors lay dead beneath the waters of Tsushima Strait. Another 6,000 had been captured, their war over before it had truly begun. Families across the Russian Empire would soon receive the terrible news that their sons, husbands, and fathers had perished in the distant waters of the Pacific, victims of imperial ambition and technological obsolescence. On the Japanese side, the victory was so complete it almost seemed unreal. Admiral Tōgō had lost just 3 torpedo boats and fewer than 200 men. The ratio of losses was so lopsided that international observers initially refused to believe the reports. How could a European great power suffer such a devastating defeat at the hands of what many still considered an upstart Asian nation? The answer lay in the revolutionary nature of naval warfare itself. Tsushima wasn't just a battle. It was a demonstration of how modern technology, superior training, and innovative tactics could overcome traditional advantages of numbers and experience. The Japanese had embraced the future of naval combat, while the Russians remained trapped in the past. The wireless telegraphy that had played such a crucial role in Japanese coordination represented just one aspect of this technological revolution. For the first time in naval history, commanders could communicate instantly with ships scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Battle plans could be adjusted in real time, reinforcements could be directed to threatened sectors, and the fog of war could be penetrated in ways that previous generations of admirals could never have imagined. Japanese rangefinding equipment had also proved decisive. Their bar and Stroud coincidence rangefinders, the latest British technology, could accurately measure distances up to 6,000 yards. Russian ships were equipped with obsolete loophole rangefinders from the 1,880 seconds that were effective only to 4,000 yards. In naval combat, where a few hundred yards could mean the difference between hitting and missing, this technological gap proved fatal. Even more revolutionary was the Japanese adoption of centrally controlled gunnery. Instead of allowing each ship to aim and fire independently, Japanese battle lines could coordinate their salvos, with multiple ships targeting the same enemy vessel simultaneously. The psychological effect of receiving concentrated fire from several ships at once was as important as the physical damage inflicted. Russian crews, already demoralized by their long voyage, found themselves overwhelmed by the intensity and accuracy of Japanese bombardment. The ammunition used by both sides told its own story of technological evolution. Russian shells were traditional armor-piercing rounds designed to punch through enemy hulls and cause internal damage. While effective against older warships, they often passed completely through lightly armored sections without exploding, causing minimal casualties among enemy crews. Japanese ammunition, by contrast, was loaded with a new type of high explosive that created devastating fires upon impact. These shells were designed not just to damage ships, but to kill the men who sailed them. When they struck Russian vessels, they turned superstructures into infernos, causing massive casualties and spreading panic through enemy crews. The psychological warfare aspect of these weapons was as important as their destructive power. The battle also marked the first decisive engagement between modern steel battleships, establishing principles that would guide naval construction for the next decade. The mixed armament philosophy that had dominated battleship design, with ships carrying guns of various calibers, was proven obsolete overnight. Tsushima demonstrated that all big gun ships with uniform main batteries were the future of naval warfare. British First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher, studying the battle reports from his London office, immediately understood the implications. Within months of Tsushima, construction began on HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary battleship that would render every existing warship obsolete. The naval arms race that followed would reshape the balance of power in Europe and contribute to the tensions that eventually exploded into World War I. But the immediate consequences of Tsushima were felt most keenly in Russia itself. News of the disaster reached St. Petersburg like a thunderbolt, shattering what remained of public confidence in the Tsarist regime. The revolution that had been simmering beneath the surface of Russian society burst into open flame. Workers struck, peasants revolted, and even elements of the military began to mutiny. The Tsar, faced with the complete collapse of his war effort and growing unrest at home, had no choice but to seek peace. President Theodore Roosevelt, recognizing an opportunity to enhance American prestige, offered to mediate between the warring powers. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, formally ended the Russo-Japanese War and established Japan as the dominant power in East Asia. For Japan, victory at Tsushima represented far more than a military triumph. It was validation of their rapid modernization, proof that an Asian nation could not only compete with European powers, but defeat them decisively. The psychological impact across Asia was enormous. If Japan could humble mighty Russia, what other seemingly impossible victories might be achieved? The battle's reverberations spread far beyond East Asia. Across the colonial empires of Europe, subject peoples began to question whether their European masters were truly invincible. The myth of Western military superiority, carefully cultivated over centuries of imperial expansion, lay shattered in the waters off Tsushima Strait. In naval circles worldwide, The lessons of Tsushima were studied and debated with intense interest. The era of close-range naval combat was clearly ending, replaced by long-range gunnery duels, where superior technology and training mattered more than courage and seamanship. Naval academies rewrote their textbooks, and shipyards began designing vessels that could fight effectively at distances that would have been unimaginable just a few years before. The human drama of Tsushima continued long after the guns fell silent. Admiral Rozhestvensky, recovered from his wounds but broken in spirit, faced a court-martial that would effectively end his career. The man who had led the Baltic Fleet on its epic journey became a scapegoat for the disaster, though the real causes lay far beyond any single commander's control. Admiral Tōgō, by contrast, became a national hero whose fame spread around the world. Western journalists dubbed him the Nelson of the East, comparing his tactical brilliance to the greatest admiral in British history. Streets were named in his honor, shrines were erected to his memory, and his victory became the stuff of legend that inspired Japanese naval officers for generations to come. The Battle of Tsushima stands as one of history's most decisive moments, a single clash that rewrote the rules of naval warfare and shifted the balance of global power forever. In just 2 days, the dreams of the Russian Empire in the east were crushed beneath the waves of the Tsushima Strait, while Japan emerged as a force that could no longer be ignored by the great powers of the world. From the frozen Baltic ports to the warm waters off Korea, we've witnessed an epic of human endurance, technological revolution, and strategic brilliance. The Russian sailors who sailed halfway around the world deserved better than the obsolete ships and outdated tactics that doomed them from the start. Their courage was never in question, but courage alone could not overcome the crushing advantages of superior technology, training, and leadership that Admiral Tōgō brought to bear. Tsushima proved that the age of empire built on tradition and prestige was ending. In its place rose a new world where innovation, preparation, and the willingness to embrace change would determine who ruled the seas. The lessons learned in those bloody waters would echo through the decades to come, shaping naval warfare through 2 world wars and beyond. This wasn't just the destruction of a fleet, it was the birth of the modern age.